Welcome to another Sunday Superversive live stream. I am your host, Benjamin Wheeler, and I'm here with Anthony Marquetta once again. Today we're bringing the long promised Last Stand stream, which focuses on our two favorite last stands. My own being the fall of Constantinople, but I think Anthony has the much more interesting and, quite frankly, unknown um, choice here. Anthony, why don't you lead us out?
Yep. Thank you, Ben. I will be discussing a last stand called the Siege of Szivetgar. You're going to have to excuse my pronunciation of all of these names. They are Croatian, which is sort of like that meme where you fall on the keyboard and write something in the comments section, then five different people come in and go, "Why did you write my name?" Uh, from Poland and that area. This is the area of the world we're talking here where all of the spellings look wrong but aren't. So, for example, Szivetgar actually has like accent marks over a couple of the letters that I didn't even try to reproduce, which is perhaps culturally insensitive, but also I don't care.
They probably
So,
stole them.
what was that?
They probably stole them. Don't worry about it.
Exactly. Siege of Szivetgar. Now, Siege of Szivetgar is kind of interesting, and I sort of found it by accident. Now, last stands in history. I'll go to my next slide. So, Ben, I am now on slide 2. Uh, Elements of a great last stand, because I want to talk about like why I picked this and why I find this so absolutely fascinating. Uh,
I'm
so
sorry. I'm trying to
the
figure out
elements
how
of
to
a
go through slides.
it's okay. Uh, you'll work it out. I believe in you. Uh, So the elements of a great last stand. You need overwhelming odds. So in a last stand, the attackers should have an overwhelming advantage over the defenders. You need to have high stakes. The outcome of the battle needs to matter. Now, sometimes it can matter in a symbolic way. For example, like I'm trying to think of how to put this. Like it could matter to it inspired people, even though technically probably the winner or loser of the battle didn't really change the outcome of people, but it mattered to people. I can't think of an example off the top of my head. I was going to say Thermopylae, but actually, now that I think about it, if Thermopylae had been a successful last stand, it would have mattered. So that's not a great example. Uh, Victory or defeat should have real consequences, though. Again, symbolic and real are not opposed to each other. Symbolic consequences does not mean they're not real consequences. It just means that they aren't in terms they aren't significant in terms of this specific battle altered the fate of the campaign. But inspiring people does really matter, right? Like it's
Yep.
not it really does make a difference. Uh a truly great last stand should have personal stories of heroism. It will feature things like the Spartans calling out Leonidas's body multiple times before the Persians reclaim it, right, at Thermopylae, which is obviously the most famous of all last stands. The Battle of Thermopylae, where the Greeks attempted and failed to hold off the Persians, but did it with much bravado. And a really great last stand will have compelling personalities. So the very best last stands feature compelling personalities to follow. Again, Thermopylae, you have Leonidas. And you have Xerxes, by the way, on the other side, who is no slouch. He is also a very interesting figure. The 300 movie with Zack Snyder, which is very entertaining and very inaccurate, didn't really get the full complexity of Xerxes, right?
Yes.
Who was Xerxes was not considered a tyrant, nor was he considered like a monster, right? Like, in
Right.
fact, he was highly respected by the Greeks. The Greeks respected Xerxes. They fought him. They wanted to defeat him. They did not want him taking them over, but they absolutely recognized that his greatness was very real. Yeah.
Yeah. There's
So this is.
there's a
Go ahead.
good book called Heredity and Fire by one Xerxes, and he basically he goes over some of the things that Xerxes does, and it shows that Xerxes, even though he is an absolute despot, an emperor, he is in fact a very reasonable personality for somebody in that position compared to what you might expect.
Yeah, it's all about the context of the time period, of course. Like,
Yep.
the really good, let me put it this way: I can imagine doing a great man stream on Xerxes, and perhaps I will one day. Probably not, but I could.
Yeah.
You know, is what I mean. Like, I could do it, and the notable example here that I can think of is the one that 300 completely twists in the entirely wrong direction of what was actually going on, which is the killing of the Persian messenger. So, the story goes that the Persians sent a messenger asking if the Spartans would surrender and blah, blah, blah. And the Spartans killed the messenger. So, when Leonidas learns this, they learn that the messenger is killed. Uh, they send two emissaries. Leonidas chooses to send two emissaries back to Xerxes and the reason that he does this is not to brag to him, but actually because this was a great disgrace. The Spartans killed a messenger, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
you never ever ever kill a messenger. That's highly immoral. That is against the will of the gods, right?
Yes.
Just an awful sacrilegious thing to do. So Sparta sends two people back with a note to Xerxes explaining what happened, and then to make up for the killing of the messenger, the two men are there to be sacrificed to Xerxes. Like, basically said, you could do whatever you want to these two men. If you kill them, that's our fair recompense. Xerxes is so impressed by the honor of the Spartans, the honor in admitting that they killed the messenger and sending recompense, that he does not kill them and instead sends them back. This was meant to reflect well on both the Spartans and Xerxes, right?
Yes.
Xerxes is meant to be portrayed as an honorable ruler who is impressed with the Spartans, and the Spartans are portrayed as honorable people who are concerned with making up for mistakes and maintaining, the will of the gods and things like that, right? So you need these compelling personalities. So I want you to keep these things in mind: overwhelming odds, high stakes, personal stories of heroism, compelling personalities. These are the elements, I think, of a truly great Last Stand. And not all Last Stands have all of these elements. For example, the famous Last Stand of the Swiss Guard, which I know the details of due to the Sabaton song, The Last Stand. Uh, it was the 1527 Last Stand, when the Holy Roman Emperor invades Rome and tries to kill the Pope, and 189 members of the Swiss Guard pulled back the entire army of the Holy Roman Empire, letting the Pope escape to a palace. I'm not sure if I haven't heard of any particularly compelling personalities among the Swiss Guards. Also, the stakes were kind of iffy. Like, he was the Pope, but it was the life of one guy, and the Pope was kind of a quisling at the time. So it's a little bit iffy, but it has enough elements to make it very, very memorable as a Last Stand. So, going to the background, which is the next slide. Now, all of those things come together in the Siege of Szivetgar, which is what makes Szivetgar so compelling. Szivetgar, like, I really want to explain this. It is, first off, one of the most important battles in the history of Western civilization that almost nobody has heard of. Right? Like, almost
Mm-hmm.
nobody even knows about Szivetgar. Now, if you live in Hungary or Croatia, you've definitely heard of Szivetgar, because Szivetgar is, a school child story. It's like learning about, Battle of Yorktown here, right?
Right.
Nicholas Zrinski is like a Washington figure. So you would absolutely know about it in Croatia. They have epic poems, they have operas dedicated to him, but all in Croatian, right?
Right. And
However,
Croatians aren't exactly dominant culturally.
yeah, exactly. It is worth noting, though, that at the time, it was recognized how important this was. For example, Cardinal Richelieu heard the result of the battle later, and he called it like the battle that saved civilization. So the people like who heard of it, who knew what was going on, they knew. And once you hear about this, I'm hopeful that you will have the same reaction that I did, which is, how do more people not know about this? Like, it's an absolutely insane battle. Uh, all of those great elements of what makes a truly great Last Stand come together in the Siege of Szigetvar, or Szivetgar. So you get this background. It's the 1500s. The Ottoman Empire is reaching its zenith at this point, under arguably its greatest emperor, Suleiman the Magnificent. So Suleiman is a very good politician, underrated in that sense, right? Certainly a great general, but he's a very good politician, and he is skillfully manipulating Hungarian infighting. So this is me skating over a lot of Hungarian history, a period of time called like the Little War, I think, which is Suleiman gets some of the Hungarians on his side by promising them land and things like that, and he manipulates into a bunch of Hungarian infighting, and he tries to take Vienna in 1529. This is a young Suleiman doing this. This is the first and less famous siege of Vienna. This is not the famous one with the winged hussars. Skillful defense and an advantageous snowfall forced Suleiman to retreat, but this still represents the absolute pinnacle of Ottoman power in Europe. Suleiman comes very close to, like, this is the Siege of Vienna later, like, it's the same situation where Vienna is the crux point of Europe. You control Vienna, you are now in a very, very, very strong position to take the rest of Europe. So this was a crucial defeat, but unlike the Second Siege of Vienna, it does not break the back of the Ottomans. The Ottomans retreat, and they go, okay, that's fine. We'll just, we'll regroup for later. And that's what happens. Suleiman survives. He was a young man here. He survives for another, 20 some years, 40 some years. So this is not the end of things. After decades of back and forth war with the Habsburgs and their descendants in the Hungarian Croatian area. Now, remember all of this, Hungary and Croatia, believe it or not, is actually a very, very important battlefield of the war. This is where you get people like Vlad Tepes, the famous Vlad the Impaler, who I will absolutely be doing a Great Man stream on one day, by the way.
Oh yeah.
Fascinating guy. Certainly not a saint, definitely a great man. Right?
Yeah.
But, like, this area of the world is the edge of the Ottoman and Christian fighting. So it's very important, right? Like, to the point where people don't really realize it. But a lot of the early, like, the fighting to get the Ottomans into Europe happens in the Hungarian Croatian area. So, after decades of back and forth war with the Habsburgs, the Ottoman win a bunch of battles. Then they lose out in a siege, which gives the Habsburgs some hope that maybe they could hold out for a little bit. But Suleiman decides he has a chance. He's now getting old. He's in his 70s to take another go at it. So to this end, he puts together an, at the time, absolutely enormous army and prepares to invade with the goal of taking Vienna once and for all. This is in 1566. Suleiman's army numbers 100,000. So roughly. You'll hear larger and smaller numbers. It goes up to 150 at the high end. Honestly, it doesn't really go below 100,000, so 100's kind of the low end. But yeah, think around 100-ish thousand. So go to the next slide. You have the defenders here. Now, I want you to think of this the way that I think of it, which is as a story, because normally this is not a great way of looking at history. History is not what you want it to be. History is what it is. That's one of the reasons, however, that I love the Siege of Szivetgar so much, is that it reads like a story, right? Like, you can look at it in that light, and it all works. So think of this like you're reading a story. Yeah, some sort of great epic poem. Now, on the Hungarian and Croatian side, things are dire. They have good reason to believe that Hungary could still be defended from the Ottomans because they had just relatively recently won a victory. They held out in a siege and they got some land back. The problem is the Hungarians were not properly united with each other. So a lot of the princes were kind of at each other's throats. Some of them had even bent the knee to Suleiman, which we'll talk about later. And Suleiman's enormous army was cause for serious alarms. So the most prominent leader of the defenders is the hero of our story, Nicola Zrinski. We're gonna have to talk a little bit about Zrinski because this man, if the term Chad means anything, it is applied to Nicola Zrinski. He was essentially a career soldier. That's like what he cut his teeth doing. Uh, he was considered minor royalty, not a king, but he held the position of what was called the Ban of Croatia, which is like a specifically Croatian royal title. And he was master of the treasury, which is pretty important. Don't get me wrong, but he wasn't a king himself, nor was he like a duke even, right? Like he would basically his family held a lot of land and had some familial connections with the royalty. You know, he would not himself have been considered a king. So he had cut his teeth in various military campaigns against Suleiman and the Ottomans. He even took part in the first siege of Vienna, where he was rewarded for his skill in the battle, by the way. Like, Nicholas Zrinski had an extremely successful military career. In a time when the Ottomans were winning a lot, Nicholas Zrinski's record against the Ottomans was very, very good. So he was like not just there, he was not just fighting, he was a good general and had a reputation as such. And Suleiman knew about him. Suleiman heard of him, right? Like he wasn't entirely a nobody. At the same time, he also was not Suleiman the Magnificent. The Ottoman Empire at this point is enormous, just absolutely massive. So Nicholas Zrinski owns a large amount of land in Croatia. Like it is not a one-to-one comparison here. If there is a closest thing to a Western counterpart to Suleiman, it would be the Holy Roman Emperor. And to be blunt, the Holy Roman Emperor did not have as much control over things as Suleiman did over his men. So when Zrinski sees what's going on, he sees Suleiman uh, putting together this army. Suleiman marches up to Belgrade. Now, at this point, I don't mention it on the slide. However, in Belgrade, there was some serious problems. Like, the prince of who was controlling Belgrade had bent the knee to Suleiman because Suleiman had offered him land. This was not like entirely uncommon. You know, this was one of the problems with the area that a lot of people, like Suleiman, was making them. Like I said, he was a skilled politician. You need to give him some credit here, right? Like Suleiman the Magnificent earned the title. Uh, he was making them very reasonable offers of basically like, look, we're going to invade anyway. You might as well side with me. I'm going to win, right? Like I'm way more powerful, and even if I do lose, like you know, I've lost taking new territory. I'm still going to be very powerful in the aftermath, right? The smart thing to do will absolutely be to ally with me, and then I'll give
Right.
you this plot of land and make you a king.
And
And so,
again, he was fairly undefeated.
right, you know, he was all not quite undefeated, but he was very, very, very good record. You know, so this was not like, to be fair to some of the kings who I mentioned as bending the knee to Suleiman, this was not an entirely I'm trying to think of the word craven, maybe not entirely craven decision to make. When you have people under your care, and on one hand you have the divided and Holy Roman Empire with its infighting and its many princes, not all of who agree, and on the other side you have the united force of the Ottomans who keep making deeper and deeper inroads into Europe every year, and you're responsible for protecting people. Well, maybe it's just smarter to, you know, accept the rule of Suleiman, control your land, be a king, right? And this is what's going on here. So he gets to Belgrade. The prince there is on his side. He welcomes him. Zrinski sees what's going on and he starts harassing Suleiman's forces. Like, once again, I'm like cutting out. He wins a couple of small battles, whatever. Uh, Now, again, what is important here, and by the way, I want to stress when I say Suleiman goes there, I mean literally goes there. Suleiman is taking part in these battles. Now, granted, he's in his 70s and has severe gout, so he's being carried on a litter. And it's actually his Grand Vizier who is in charge properly of the army, but Suleiman is there, right? Like, he is actually traveling with the army. And to be honest with you, I have to admit that I think this is to Suleiman's credit, right? Like, if you're going to put your men at risk, you know, if you're going to say we're going to fight for this glory and whatever, you got to show your men that you believe that the risk is worth the glory, and you do that by going with them in the fight, right? So I do give Suleiman some credit for this. Uh, anyway, we he hears about Zrinski harassing his men, fighting his forces. The original plan was not even to go near Szivetgar, right? Like he wasn't even planning on going there, but he figures that if he goes after Szivetgar, he'll draw Zrinski out because it's Zrinski's area, right? Like this is part of the area that Zrinski controls, like where I mentioned he controlled a bunch of land, So he figures this will draw Zrinski out and he can eliminate him once and for all as a rival, right? Because Zrinski is more like a pest to Suleiman at this point. He's very annoying. You draw him out, you get rid of him, then you don't need to worry about him. It's worth noting, though, that he took Zrinski seriously enough to change his plans when he knew that Zrinski was involved in the defense, and he wanted to deal with him. So this is a big deal. Right? So he's at Belgrade, and he decides he's going to go and attack Szivetgar. Now, getting an army. This is the next slide. In truth, Zrinski had very few men. He was harassing Suleiman with what was essentially a skirmish force. After learning that Suleiman was going to go through Szivetgar, he decides to take the bait and use Szivetgar to create a last stand. Zrinski's no idiot. He knows what Suleiman's doing. Everybody knew. But he's like, you know what? Like, this is an opportunity that I'm going to take. He was actually offered the chance to leave the defense of Szivetgar to a subordinate, but he chose to stay and defend the fortress at Szivetgar. So this is very important. They give him a chance to leave. He doesn't need to be there in a battle that he knows he will probably lose, right? This is basically an unwinnable battle. And he chooses to stay because he believes that he gives his men the best chance if he stays. This is the sort of man, I want you to get this in your head, this is the sort of man that Nikola Zrinski was. He wasn't going to abandon his people. So it was very clear at this point that the Croatians and the Hungarians were just too divided to send help. Some had bent the knee already to the Ottomans and were less than useless. So Zrinski bolsters his force basically by calling in every personal favor he had ever had owed to him over his long military career. He begs his friends. He begs his allies. He asks every single person he could to join him in his final stand against the Ottomans. And in the end, he manages to put together a defensive force of about 2,300 men to stand against Suleiman's 100,000. And by the way, again, I want to emphasize 100,000 is the low estimate. The high estimate's somewhere around 150. Okay. So, this is the background to the battle. Everything is set up. Suleiman has put together a massive army. He is in his late 70s. This is his one last big push to take Vienna before he dies. He is personally leading the army along with his Grand Vizier, and he redirects to Szivetgar in order to lure out Nikola Zrinski and take him out so he doesn't need to worry about him. Nikola Zrinski learns about this. He decides to intentionally take the bait and bring an army to Szivetgar. He musters together this tiny little force and holes up in the town. Right? So, next slide, we're at August 5th. The siege begins. So, an important note is that Suleiman was personally present, as was his second in command, like I mentioned. His second in command was Grand Vizier Mehmed Pasha, and he was the real commander of the army, even though Suleiman was there. This is because Suleiman had gout. He had gout. It was very painful. He could barely walk, so there you go. Truthfully, Suleiman did not expect the siege to last very long. After all, he outnumbered the defenders by an insane amount. I didn't even try and do the math. And more than that, the Ottomans were experienced in fighting Hungarians and Croatians. Like, he knew what he was fighting. He knew how much he outnumbered them by. He had no reason to believe that this wouldn't be an easy victory. Like, everything is pointing to the fact that he is going to steamroll this defensive force, right? There's just nothing that would point you in any other direction. The Ottomans even announce themselves when they arrive at the town with cannon fire, intending this to be an impressive display of overwhelming might. The Ottomans are so confident; they're not interested at all in starting suddenly and surprising the defenders or whatever. They're trying to intimidate them instead, which is not a bad strategy, right? So Zrinski splits the town in three. I don't go into detail here, but basically it's like the outskirts, the actual town proper, and the castle. Yeah. With the final defenses centering around the castle in the center of the town, and his well-organized defenders managed to hold off the day one assault. And despite the importance of the battle, there is nobody else even slightly prepared to take on Suleiman. So this battle is incredibly important. Like, if Suleiman makes it through Szivetgar, I really want to stress this, he is almost certainly going to be able to take Vienna. There is nobody else. Nobody is prepared. Nobody is willing to send reinforcements. Not even Vienna is willing to send reinforcements. You know, the ones he's basically doing this for Vienna, but they're not willing to send reinforcements. Zrinski is on his own. Next slide. This is the siege. Suleiman expected the city to fall within a week. This did not happen. Day after day after day, the Ottomans made slow, grinding progress against the Croatian position, yet the Croatians continued to fight on. The notable thing that happens here is that at one point, Suleiman is fed up with how long it's taking and how stubbornly the city is being defended. So he makes an offer to Zrinski to make him king of all Croatia, a tactic that had worked with other Hungarians and Croatians. But again, that is not the sort of man that Zrinski is, and we would not be telling the story if he was that sort of man. Zrinski completely ignores the offer and fights on. He doesn't even respond. It's like not worth considering to him. He would never dare to betray his men and his people like that, and betray the people of Vienna, and leave Christendom to be plundered and controlled by invading Muslims, right? So the Holy Roman Emperor actually does put together a fairly sizable force of 80,000. He's really not close enough to help Szivetgar, but he very seriously considers at one point attacking another part of the map to try and draw the Ottomans away, but he hesitates. He can't bring himself to do it because he knows if he does, he's probably going to lose the battle. Right? If he draws the Ottomans away to fight him, the Ottomans probably are going to defeat him. And then that leaves him with no defensive force. It's a risky maneuver if he does this, right? So he hesitates, leaving the Szivetgar defenders to die. So the Holy Roman Emperor has men that he can send in to help, but he doesn't. Because he hesitates, he won't do it. So the Szivetgar defenders are still on their own. So I want to be very clear as we're talking about the siege. The Szivetgar defenders will lose. There is no miraculous victory that can come out of this. It can't happen. The question is when and how many Ottomans they can take down when they do. So that's where you go like, okay, so why am I talking about this? Well, we'll continue. So let's go. We're going to skip ahead to the last day. That's the next slide. It is September 6th, the second to last day of the siege of Szivetgar. The defenders, starting at 2,300, remember, are down to 600. They have taken down over 20,000 Ottoman attackers. This has cost the Ottomans far more men and far more time than anticipated, but it seems the castle is about to fall, but the Ottomans hesitate, because Suleiman the Magnificent dies in his tent of a heart attack. That's right, at this battle, which nobody has ever heard of, this is the battle where Suleiman the Magnificent died. So Grand Vizier Pasha acts fast, knowing the army will fall apart if the news gets out. He ships the body back to Constantinople in secret, and has the Sultan's physician killed to keep the secret. The final siege of the castle is planned for September 7th, 1566. So the Grand Vizier takes control of it. They just say, like, Suleiman's in his tent. Don't worry about him, right? He lies. He doesn't tell them. Now, if it gets out that Suleiman is dead, this could be devastating to the attack. Like, they probably will not finish the assault, but he keeps it hidden smartly. So we'll go next slide, the final attack. So it is this final Ottoman assault that turns this battle into the stuff of legends. First, the Ottomans tear through the city with cannonballs, using Greek fire to set the castle ablaze. Nicholas Zrinski makes a fateful decision here. This is the end. This is it. There is no surviving this. They could surrender. There's only 600 men left anyway. So they could surrender, but Nicholas Zrinski is not that sort of man. And he knows his duty here. He needs Szivetgar might fall, but he must protect the rest of Christendom from the Ottomans. He must do his duty. And that means instead of holding up in the castle or surrendering, they are going to strike back. He addresses his troops one last time with one of the great final speeches in military history. And he gives us this incredible quote: "Let us go out from this burning place into the open and stand up to our enemies. Who dies, he will be with God. Who dies not, his name will be honored. I will go first, and what I do, you do. And God is my witness. I will never leave you, my brothers and knights." I just want to get through like how much meaning this speech has coming from Nicholas Zrinski, because Nicholas Zrinski did not have to be there. He chose to stay. He could have left a subordinate in charge of the seas of Szivetgar. They even told him to do that, but he chose to stay with his men. So this is a speech that had to have had so much meaning to his men. As the Turks press forward on a narrow bridge, Zrinski flings open the castle doors, revealing a mortar loaded with broken iron that fires and kills 600 attackers. Zrinski led the charge of his men against the Ottomans. He takes 2 musket balls to the chest and keeps fighting, only finally dying after taking an arrow to the head. It's worth noting that after being beheaded, his head bounced around the Ottomans for a while before eventually getting to his family and getting buried. Interestingly, though, and part of like the legend of Zrinski, his body was given an honorable burial by a Turk, so an Ottoman, who had been Zrinski's prisoner but was treated well by him. So a former prisoner of Zrinski's ensures that Zrinski is given an honorable burial because of how Zrinski had treated him when he was his prisoner, which is remarkable. We'll go with the final twist. This is the next slide. The Ottomans swarm into the castle. The battle is over, and then, while searching the castle for treasure, one member of Zrinski's household warns the vizier that the house is rigged to explode due to 3,000 pounds of powder buried in the basement. The vizier himself barely manages to escape the castle, but it did explode, killing another 3,000 Ottomans. And now, finally, the siege of Szivetgar was over. The defenders had about 7 or so survivors, all spared by Janissaries. Janissaries were basically like Islamic mercenaries. You know, they were mercenaries hired by the Ottomans, who admired their courage. So, all of the defenders are dead, but 7. And next slide, the aftermath. After essentially all of the defenders had been wiped out, the Ottomans declared victory, but at a very, very heavy cost. The defenders had been wiped out nearly to the man, but the Ottomans lost somewhere between 20,000 and 35,000 men. Suleiman's death halted the campaign in its tracks, but it is worth noting that, number 1, Suleiman died at the last day of the battle. And 2, with the onset of winter, they had held up long enough to make it so that winter was coming. The campaign probably would have stopped there, or near there, I should say, anyway. In other words, I want to be very clear about this. It is the fact that the defense of Szivetgar lasted so long and was so costly that is the main reason the Ottoman offensive was halted before Vienna. Or to put it another way, Nikola Zrinski and the defenders of Szigetvar, though they technically lost the battle, saved Christendom from the Ottomans due to this battle. You pretty much, like, I don't know how you would overstate the importance of this battle. Like, the fact that they held out for 3 weeks longer than expected is the reason that Suleiman died. It's the reason that the campaign was no longer practical for the Ottomans because winter was coming. It's the reason that the Ottomans had to stop. It's the reason that Vienna wasn't taken over. It saved Europe. So, final slide. Back to the original points. This last stand had overwhelming odds. The defenders could reasonably have been expected to be wiped out within a week and instead lasted a month. high stakes. The fate of Vienna and all of Christendom essentially depended on the outcome of this battle. Personal story of heroism. The story of Nicholas Rinsky's amazing final speech and last stand are as striking as any tale of Leonidas. Compelling personalities. So you have the perspective of career soldier and everyman Nicholas Rinsky facing off against the great Sultan Suleiman, inspiring his men around him through sheer force of personality and a long military career spent building respect is one of the most compelling personal conflicts I've ever seen in one of these sorts of stories. Like, my opinion of Nicholas Rinsky as I've read more about him has grown and grown and grown. This man should be on a list with people like Hannibal. Like, the victories that he won and the importance of those victories, the things that he did in the face of overwhelming odds, not to mention the incredible integrity that he showed throughout all of it. The integrity he showed to his men. You don't hear of any sort of personal scandal in the life of Nicholas Zarinsky. Nothing like with Cortez, who was a known womanizer or anything like that. This man is an absolute legend. He is one of the great heroes of Christendom. He really, like, you think of like Don John of Austria or something like that. Uh, in G.K. Chesterton's poem Lepanto, like, he is as significant or more significant of a figure than him. Like, this is an unbelievable human being. And this is, in my opinion, the greatest last stand in history. It has everything. It's got an incredible final dramatic ending. It's got the setup. It's got you have this contrast of personalities of the traitors and quislings around him, contrasted with the integrity of not only Nicholas Rinsky but also Suleiman, right? Suleiman goes into battle with his men. Suleiman travels with his army. I don't know if you guys, we've talked about Legend of the Galactic Heroes on the show, but I think of that being a point on that show where uh, Lowengram, the Emperor, he earns the respect of Yang Wen Li because he makes sure that he goes into battle with his men, which the old emperors did not do. It's a personal touch that really makes a difference and makes this whole thing so much more compelling. It's a clash of Christendom versus the Ottomans, and there's something about the underdog story here that's distinctly Christian to me as well, right? The babe in the manger who overcomes the world type of thing. You have this led by a stalwart defender of the faith like Nicola Zarinsky against the mighty, overwhelming power and might of the Ottoman Empire, and he manages to hold them off and save Europe. Europe is not seriously threatened again, as a whole, I should say. I mean, the Ottomans continue fighting, but it's not seriously threatened again until around 100 years later when we get the other siege of Vienna. That siege of Vienna is significant in that there was no retreating and licking their wounds. It broke the back of the Ottoman power. The charge of the Winged Hussars was notable not just because it ended that siege, but because it completely wrecked the Ottoman army and ended any serious threat of Muslim expansion from ever happening again. Uh, but without this battle, that battle couldn't have happened. It was that important. That it's not more well known is a travesty. Any questions, Ben?
Uh, no, I mean it's a pretty amazing thing. I sort of equate the fame of it compared to things that Daniel Boone or Davy Crockett did. That is really famous in America and certainly parts of the Midwest, but is not necessarily famous outside of it, even though it's incredibly important. If the Ottomans had taken Vienna and had turned it into a base by which they could invade the rest of Europe, we'd be speaking, we'd be Muslim, not Christian. Well, we'd be
Yep.
Christian, but we wouldn't be Christian, very well as we are now. Because there was also a strong sense of removal of Christianity from Ottoman territories. They were not as benevolent as some liberal historians may say. Um, I'm quite amazed by it. I love that last bit, that last, FU kind of thing where they have 3,000 pounds of powder in the basement. And you can imagine it, the vizier's like, yes, we've won. Tell me your secrets. Oh, I've got a secret for you. We've got 3,000 pounds of powder in the basement. The vizier thinks about it for a second and then just starts running.
Yep, yep.
It's
Uh,
good.
it, it reminds me too of like I will say, how about I put it this way? Like, one thing that did get me reading this is that I did gain some respect for Suleiman over
Oh,
this, right?
yeah.
Like, not don't get me wrong. I think that Suleiman was a tyrant, pretty much, right?
Mm,
Or at the very least, Suleiman was a he was a wicked leader in a lot of ways. But the flip side of this is that Suleiman did do some pretty remarkable things, and he had a sense of honor to him. Like I said, I was honestly pretty impressed to learn that Suleiman joined the battle himself. Right?
mm,
Like, I did not know that he took direct part in his assaults and things. It's not always the norm, but he did, and I think that there's something that's genuinely admirable about this. Right? Like, he was fighting for the glory of Islam and the glory of his empire, but even though he was expecting his men to fight for him, he wasn't expecting them to fight without him. He was showing them that he too considered it a cause worth fighting for, right? And there's
mm.
something to that. Yeah. So we got a comment. Caitlin asks, "I might be aging myself, but who is Daniel Boone? Would you like to take it, Ben?"
Daniel Boone was a American frontiersman who blazed a lot of the trails. Like if you were to drive from where Anthony is on the East Coast to where I am in St. Louis, you would actually drive through many different trails that he blazed. So like the highways within reason, not one to one, but the highways that you would drive over the Appalachian Mountain often go through trails that Daniel Boone blazed. He also did a lot of great heroic deeds. He was an Indian fighter, and he, in general, just sort of worked to make the frontier livable for people. Um, a big story of his is his daughters were captured by Indian slave takers, and he hunted them down day and night and brought some of them back. Um, it's an amazing story of the American frontier. And it's not taught in schools, both because it does portray a Native Americans, Indians in a poor light, but also because, why should Americans have American heroes? Um, you know, he's somebody to remember and someone to sort of respect in the American history. He was never a president. Maybe he was a I think he was no, that was David Crockett of the Alamo fame, uh, which is a
Yeah,
great story. By the way, we have to do a last stand stream on the Alamo someday.
we
Uh,
do. The thing about the Alamo, though, one of my problems with it is that there's a lot of mythology surrounding the Alamo.
oh yeah,
Uh, Davy Crockett, I think, like the one thing I want to stress with Davy Crockett is before we get to the Alamo stream, is that whatever happened at the Alamo, Davy Crockett was actually already a remarkable person
yep,
before the Alamo. Uh, like
oh yeah,
he was quite an incredible person, even if the Alamo had never happened. Now, when you get into what actually happened at the Alamo, so much mythology built around it, it actually gets really difficult to figure out what was real and what was like a legend.
yep.
Yeah, but yeah, you're right. It's worth talking about for sure.
Oh yeah, and it's just a fun story in general. Like Santa Anna is one of those characters who wishes he was a little bit greater, a little bit better. He wanted to be Napoleon, but he just couldn't pull it off the same way.
Yeah, a
Uh,
lot of the Texans are pretty incredible. Like
oh
Sam
yeah,
Houston, for example, was a man of incredible honor. and incredible capability as well, who's kind of underrated by the larger world,
Yeah.
because, like you said, he sort of left everything in Texas. Now, the difference, though, between a lot of these stories and like the siege of Szivetgar to me is that Szivetgar was important, like really, to everyone. It's just that my theory for why it's not more famous is just that it didn't happen in the heart of Europe. It happened at the edge of Europe,
Mm.
right? Like Thermopylae, it sounds weird to say this, it did happen in the heart of Europe because Europe began in Greece. Yeah,
Yeah.
properly speaking, Western civilization began in Greece. Thermopylae did happen in the heart of Europe. This battle did not. It happened at the edge of Europe before he reached the major cities like Vienna and Rome, and right, all of those places, right?
Mm-hmm.
It happened before that. So as a result, it's like everybody who was in Europe proper is like, well, I guess they didn't do anything, right?
Right.
Which is true. They didn't because of the siege of Szivetgar. Like the and there's also just something to the fact of Nicholas Zrinsky was given multiple chances to back out and he wouldn't do it, which makes this so impressive to me. Like them telling him, "Hey, maybe you should just leave the defense of the city to a subordinate," and he's like, "No, they need me," right? Like, and he
Mm-hmm.
was right. He was absolutely right. Like, so many things, if they had gone differently or been done differently, we might be seeing something very different. Because you need to remember that even though, yes, the invasion stopped because Suleiman died, but he died on the last day of a battle that was only supposed to last less than a week.
Yep.
Like, they would have invaded way further into the countryside, of Europe if they hadn't held out for as long as they did. Not to mention, it was getting closer and closer to winter. So it becomes unclear if the Ottomans could have pressed on to Vienna like they wanted to, uh, due to the advent of winter. So the fact that they held out as long as they did, like Nicholas Zrinsky was right. They needed him there, and it had to be him. That's the other thing. There was no one else, right? Like it was
Mm-hmm.
him or no one.
Right.
I'd love to see a movie on this one day. In 50 years, this is going to be my magnum opus. I'm going to write a novel about the Siege of Szivetgar. It's going to be 900 pages, and it will have extensive footnotes.
Oh yeah. Yeah. All right. You got anything else, Anthony?
Nope, I took it to 757, so I think that's a pretty good that's a pretty good job. Uh you're good to go, Ben, for your Constantinople stream.
Oh yes. Uh, I am a Romaboo. I am obsessed with Rome. I love Rome. Uh,
Who doesn't?
who doesn't? Sick people, degenerates, uh,
Mhm.
absolute disgusting perverts. Uh, they probably do things like promote Islam over Christianity and uh, I don't know, think Julius Caesar was a tyrant. Disgusting. Uh, but no, I'm not talking about the glory days of Rome when there were two consuls fighting the long odds against the greatest generals of their era. No, I'm not talking about emperors who sent forth endless legions to destroy the enemies of mankind, Germans. Nor am I discussing even the kings of Rome, who were great men in their own right. One considers Romulus a city builder, or Numa Pompilius the founder of their laws and religion. Uh, no, no. I'm not even talking about great men, truly great men like Heraclitus and others, who fought to keep Byzantium free from the thousand enemies that always beset it. Every year, a new nomad horde cresting the hills and coming down on Byzantine territory. No, I must speak of the fall of Constantinople. Rome fell in 476 or 73 or 478, depending on which of the many heretical choices you decide to make. But in reality, uh, Rome as an emperor fell with the deposition of Romulus Augustulus from Ravenna by the conquering horde of Odoacer, who then sent the imperial regalia to Byzantium and then claimed loyalty to Byzantium, which of course he was not loyal at all. Uh, Byzantium itself lasted nearly 1,000 years after the fall of Rome, uh, and while it did experience great peaks with the likes of Justinian, um uh, oh my goodness, I want to say it was one of the emperors between Justinian and Heraclitus. Wrote many books on strategy, and then also you have Heraclitus himself, where the bounds of the empire grew. You have Basil Bulgar Slayer as well, great emperors. Um, though sadly, whatever these men pushed the realms to in their heights, the realm was always shrinking, always decreasing. Civil wars tore them apart, intrigue. They could never seem to get a succession plan together that would work. You would have anarchies and civil wars and absolute morons who were, quite frankly, demon possessed, like Focus. You have these horrible evil people, and you have these great people. But the great people, even the likes of the Kamenenoi or John Palaeologos, or even Basil Bulgar Slayer, could never quite return the glories of Rome. Instead, decline continued and continued, and plague struck, and the economy fell apart, and choices were made to remove little bits of Byzantine power just because it would bring in a few more coins or save the empire for a few more years. But in the end, the Constantinople, the last remnants of the Roman Empire that could claim direct descendant from Rome, fell. Uh, it was the year 1453. Mehmet the Second came up and laid siege to the city. In the previous years, he had sieged Mehmet the Conqueror, for those who are checking out which Mehmet it is. Uh, Mehmet and his predecessors had sieged different parts of Constantinople's territory. They used great tactics, strategies, and could rely on massive armies. In a time when an army might be a mere 10,000 men, they were fielding 50,000. Admittedly, they were usually lower quality troops. Even the legendary Janissary corps, not as good as some others, and certainly not as good as knights or hussars. But they could suffice against the levied armies of most of their enemies. What's more, they were backed by the power of Islam, which in that day was reaching an absolute climax of power and prestige. This continues on until they've eaten every little bit and even forced the Roman Emperor Constantine 11 Palaeologos into vassalage when they took his city of Moria, or rather besieged it and forced him into submission. Constantine XI was not emperor at that time, but rather was feuding with his brothers in another Roman civil war, of which there are several hundred. In fact, it is easier to say which years did not involve a Roman civil war than it is to say that there was one. And quite frankly, I can't name a single year. Perhaps when some of the Kamenenoi and Basil Bulgar Slayer were in power, Heraclitus and others, But it's there were more civil wars than not. Again, they never fixed a secession plan, and that's ultimately what killed them. Because Constantine Palaeologos uh, could not rely on support. Much like the gentleman in Croatia, who I will not try to say the name of, as Mehmet II came to conquer Constantinople, he did not receive as many troops as he needed. He received about 2,000 foreigner troops and had about 5,000 native troops to his name at the time. He knew that he had some cards to play. He threatened to release rival princes and quite a few other things as well. But when it came down to it, Mehmed II smelled blood in the water. He wanted Constantinople, and he wasn't leaving without it. Uh, the fun thing about Mehmed II was that he had only succeeded his father 2 years ago. He was 21 years old when he laid his famous siege to Constantinople. Uh, they thought that he would be some sort of, inexperienced ruler of the Ottomans, but quite frankly, he does seem a man destined for greatness by God Himself. And it's very clear that through his life and actions, that he had a certain blessing for him. Uh, he starts the siege uh, with this speech. This is Mehmed II talking from Michael Critobulus. My friends and men of my empire, you all know very well that our forefathers secured this kingdom that we now hold at the cost of many struggles and very great dangers, and that, having passed it along in succession from their fathers, from father to son, they handed it down to me. For some of the oldest of you were sharers in many of the exploits carried through by them, those at least of you who are of maturer years, and the younger of you have heard these deeds from your fathers. They are not such very ancient events, nor of such sort as to be forgotten through the lapse of time. Still, the eyewitness of those who have seen testifies better than does the hearing of deeds that happened but yesterday or the day before. He fires up his men and promises them great loot. He has brought a secret weapon. Even with a fleet, his real secret is the Dardanelles gun and the what's the term they use? Bombards. And the bombards they brought, uh, both from Turkish sources and from European sources. Orban, a Hungarian, who has very little information about him, just that he was a Hungarian or perhaps German who worked for him, had a special bombard that could fling a 600-pound stone over a mile away. The Byzantines were not able to pay for him, so he went to the Ottomans. Uh, there's a statement about the Crusaders that has stuck with me, is that when they were losing, they won all their battles, but when they were winning, they lost all their battles because they could not give up their personal projects and pride when they were winning. But when they were losing, they were able to knock some sense into their own heads and work together. Throughout it all, the Emperor of Constantinople was gathering in what resources and fighting men he could. But quite frankly, it would never be enough. Even with some support from Rome over some, shall we say, now unimportant documents that, quite frankly, I can't be bothered to read because it's about the reunification of Catholicism and Orthodoxy, and that was a sore point on everyone's minds. No one wanted it, except for maybe the Pope and some cardinals, and no one could even encompass it. Even with the Emperor of Constantinople making such concessions to Rome, it was never enough and never inspired his people like it should. Constantine XI Palaeologos was himself as active a man as Mehmed II, though it's clear that while Mehmed II was fortunate, Constantine XI Palaeologos was unfortunate. Even ignoring his feuding with his brothers, reforms and attempts to repair the wall and a thousand other little things that he tried to do failed. Even ignoring the Bombards, the Theodosian walls, which had been the bulwark of Constantinople for 800 years and had defeated many Muslim sieges before. Like these things were tried and true. Uh, he couldn't do it. He couldn't pull it enough together. And everyone knew it. This would be the last siege of Constantinople. Even before the Bombards began their work, they could see it coming. Uh, they still gave it the strongest fight they could. They did believe in the walls. I don't want to, sort of put them down for it. But the thing is that cannons were a new part of siege warfare that no one had yet encompassed to their full extent. You're familiar with castles, I'm sure. The Theodosian walls are just a massive castle. But castles changed from sheer walls to the star fort formations that you see over the next 100 years from when castles were stopped being built, at least for defense and not for decoration, precisely because of cannons. It turns out a mound of earth that's hard to scale by an infantryman is better defense when you calculate for cannons than sheer walls that a cannon can knock down. While they did have some good fleet power, and while their men were tried and true, these were not weak. These were not weak troops. Even some mercenaries from Italy. Uh, mm, I just keep coming back to the fact that maybe if they had known about the cannons, maybe if there was a counter strategy that some previous emperor had developed to defeat the cannons, maybe something would be different, but no. In fact, the siege continued on. No preparation was enough. No, no collection of, um, no collection of men or arms was enough. They took the stronghold surrounding Constantinople. The Muslims did, the Ottomans. Uh, Even though the cannons of the Ottomans were imprecise, uh, eventually they started running out of materials. Uh, this continued on. There were many assaults on Constantinople, and all the time the emperor was with his men. The emperor fought with his men and did his best to prevent the siege reaching its final moments. Uh, Sadly, Constantine Paleologos, even though he had been married twice, had no children. His wife had died. His first wife had died just a year after, uh, and his second bride never even left her father's court because of the siege. A Georgian princess. Uh, I keep whenever I read and research Constantine's Paleologos' life, I just see failure after failure on a man who was put in a corner and decided he was going to fight to the last, and that is what he did. Before the siege, Mehmed II did make an offer to him, an out, an opportunity for Constantine XI to keep his life, if you can trust an Ottoman. Uh, he would even be given rulership over a small area. So he would be, still an emperor of a tiny empire, but still an emperor. He says, Constantine replies in this manner: To surrender the city to you is beyond my authority or anyone else's who lives in it. For all of us, after taking the mutual decision, shall die out of free will without sparing our lives. Uh, and it's true. The odds against the Ottoman forces were The odds facing the Constantinople defenders was overwhelming. Uh, Mehmed II has said to have had 50,000 troops, or as many as 200, or as many as 300,000 troops. I believe that it's certainly somewhere in the six figures, just simply because they could expect that. They had that power at that time, and they were under an energized emperor. People mistake the power of an energized ruler. If Constantine XIth Palaeologos had been any less of a man, any less active of a man, either the city would have been delivered without a siege, or the siege would not have been as long and drawn out. For it took well over a month, even considering the. Let me see here, because there were. Sorry, I was just reading about the fortresses and stuff like that. See if there's any little stories or anything like that. No, it's just fighting and slogging and the defenses of Constantinople holding firm for time after time. You had mines dug, counter mines dug, Greek fire. You had, torture and spies and counter spies. Uh, it continues on. Uh, the last attack uh, began on the evening of 26th of May uh, and continued on for quite some time, on and off until shortly after midnight on Tuesday, May 29th. Uh, they made the final go of it. Uh, they fought and they fought and they fought, and eventually it came down to it on May 29th, 1453. Constantine Palaeologos is told that the Ottoman troops are pouring in, and he says, "The city is fallen, and I am still alive." He throws off his regalia and charges in with his last soldiers to fight to the last. It is noted that no one believes his body was found, um, though some relics of his is believed to have found. His body itself was not. In fact, there's even some legends that say that he is trapped in a statue of marble and will come again to recreate his lost empire. Uh, though, hmm, one thinks about it. Frederick Barbarossa, King Arthur, Constantine Palaeologos. What a time it will be when all these men come back. Uh, the city was taken, the city was sacked, uh, people taken as slaves, women outraged, all the usual travesties of war. But they could not find his Constantine 11th Palaeologos' body, and they could not mock him. Though they did do it, they trampled on Hagia Sophia, they destroyed what they could not sell, they did many horrible things, and then they began to settle in. Overwhelming odds, yes, I mentioned those earlier. Many hundreds of thousands of Ottomans against not even 10,000 defenders of Constantinople. High stakes. Sadly, the stakes aren't very high. Constantinople was dying. The Byzantine empire was dying. There's nothing that could have been done. It was so small, and the enemies surrounding it were so great. They even bickered as the siege began. Person,
So,
mm,
so one thing I'll mention, you're right in that this was an inevitability. It was going to happen. But I think that you could say when you talk about high stakes, this was the end of several thousand years of steady, of a straight line of Roman rule, right? Like
yes,
when we talk about the line of Roman government, we're not talking about somebody came in and like resurrected at some point. No, we're talking about there is a direct descent of this ruler to this ruler to this ruler that you can bring all the way back to the kings of Rome
Yes.
that ended at the siege of Constantinople. So, in that sense, it's unbelievably significant. And I'll also mention arguably ended because it is true that the Roman Empire had been ruled by conquerors before, and the Sultan did fancy himself not the ender of the Roman Empire, but rather the conquering emperor. So make of that what you will.
Yes. Though I do not consider it much of a good claim, both because he is a Asian Turk, he is not a Christian, and the lands he took had nothing to do with Rome at that time except for their history. Uh, quite frankly, I am more amenable to several different options on the fall on whether Rome exists or not, though I will speak of them in a few moments. Personal
Hmm.
stories of heroism. The city has fallen, and I am still alive. Amazing. Constantine XI Palaiologos is absolutely one of the most heroic figures of history, not because of his great victories, but because of how he handled his losses. The man never gave up. The man was always fighting, always trying to push himself to that next round, always trying to revive whatever he had at his hands. Even though he had to play the occasional Constantinople Byzantine game, he did do his best to make better decisions than what is tended to be expected out of such gentlemen. Like I've said in the past of this stream, uh, there were absolutely more Roman civil wars than there should have been, even into the Byzantine era. Uh, what's more, there is something interesting with Mehmed II. He is a man of history who is quite interesting. His epithet, the Conqueror, was honestly earned. Like Suleiman the Magnificent, he went into battle himself, and while he was not on the front lines in the same way that Constantine XI Palaiologos was, he was certainly there in danger as much as could be expected of a sultan like that. Um, he has his own long history. I'm not really interested in doing a stream about him or anything like that. But he and the other Ottoman emperors who are worth anything are certainly interesting to follow. Um,
Yeah, I'll also note that, like a lot of the truly great men of history, he was a man who recognized his own historical importance.
mm,
Like he understood what the taking of Constantinople meant,
oh yeah, he wanted
right?
it.
Like,
He wanted it badly.
hmm that, and you're right, and that's like, well, it didn't really mean anything in one sense because what is one weak, tiny city when you have all of the islands? But on the flip side, it meant everything, right? And it did.
Sure.
Like, so they had the union. You mentioned the union between the Orthodox and Catholic churches. Constantine XI supported it. He supported it because, frankly, uh, he knew that he kind of had to. They needed the help of Rome, right? So
Yes.
he was like, "Hey guys, maybe you should just take the L here." And then you have people like Mark of Ephesus, who is an Orthodox saint, telling, "No, we refuse. We won't go under the thumb of the Romans and Constantinople falls." Uh, like, don't get me wrong. I actually don't think that Rome would have been able to save them. Uh,
No.
but like, it was over, right? Like, it was gonna happen either way. But with that said, I think there is something to the fact we've had the Orthodox Catholic stream before, and I always mention this was something about the Orthodox that really bothered me. Like, this strikes me as a moment where humility might have been called for. Uh, and, considering the situation of the Orthodox, and
Yes.
it makes me think of, like, so how many deaths on your head are worth freedom from the Pope in this moment? I don't know. But I get it. Like, if you're Orthodox, you're going to be like, well, then, it's religion. So, like, There is no price. Sure, but but
I don't think you'll have me agree with
yeah.
you because they're so like I'm gonna stop right here, because I've seen this with a lot of Catholics as in general. Death is preferable than to contradict anything of what I understand and hold true about Jesus Christ.
Like so, yes, right,
But here's the second bit,
absolutely.
because here's the second bit, because there's two bits to this.
Okay,
I cannot
all right
trust
then.
that even though there are many Christian Catholics, that the religion I hold true to, the faith that I have, will be preserved accurately and honestly if I were to accept the Catechism. I will remind you that Catholics have said to me to my face that works save them. They deny the free gift of God, of grace, of salvation. And these people are not intelligent enough to bring up James 2. I'll admit that. But the thing is, you know how I feel about these things. Even though the Orthodox are much further from God than your average Catholic, you can look at their civilization and its fruits and can tell that they're worse off than any Italian ever. Any Slav is worse off than any Italian. You cannot say, I understand the truth of Jesus Christ, therefore it is comparable and one to one to change
So
from one strongly held belief to a polar opposite. Because I
so
would then have to hold. I know this isn't a Protestant versus Catholic stream, but to be a Catholic, and if I'm going to hold a religion, I must be 100% honest with it. To be a Catholic, I would have to accept the things about, say, Mary that I absolutely refuse. For the simple reason is that I believe that it interferes with the process of salvation.
So I get everything that you're saying, and you're right. This is like in the sense of if I were Orthodox, that's pretty much the response I would make in the basic sense of well, it's truths of the faith, and you never ever compromise on that. However, I am going to counter not exactly with like oh I disagree, like whatever. That's not the point of the stream, like you said.
Yeah.
My point is more that what you need to understand is at the time the idea of what is the true Christian faith was a little bit different than what was thought of now.
Yeah.
The Catholic and the Orthodox at that point were genuinely like separated brethren. There was a period of time where it was unclear if they were even two different religions. Then, as time passed, it slowly became more and more clear that,
Mm.
yeah, they're not really united, right? So the Council of Florence was this attempt to try and bring them together that the Orthodox cardinals accepted.
Yes.
Now,
Some. Yeah.
granted, you are right; they accepted it because they had to, right? Like,
Mm.
and I don't even blame. I blame neither the Orthodox or the Romans for this, right? Like, I think it
Mm.
was just the situation. You know,
Yeah.
like I don't think there's anybody to blame per se,
Yeah.
right? But they accepted it because they had to.
Yeah.
And then they like, people got fed up and then they said, no, screw this. We're not doing like you're gonna really make us believe all this. We're not doing this.
Yeah.
Right. Uh and
Yeah.
that's kind of what happened. And Constantine the 11th saw the political situation on the ground, and he was like, "Hey guys, maybe we should take that very generous offer that Rome made." Now, Constantine was again attempting to defend his homeland, right?
Yes.
So consider, I don't blame him for that. But what I'm trying to get at here is that the fundamental difference at the time ultimately was less one of theology of compromising on truths of the faith and one of authority, which is different than how a lot of like the Protestant Catholic disputes in the modern day. Like you centered your whole objection, which I think, by the way, is a correct way to center your objection on matters of faith. There are things that the Catholic Church accepts that I do not. So, in honesty and good conscience, I could not be a Catholic, and fair enough, right? Like,
Right.
that's the honest way. That's the honest answer that you would need to give. Uh, However, when it comes to the Orthodox Catholic disputes, yes, you get at the very, very high level things like the filioque,
Yeah.
right? But let's be honest here. I have studied the filioque. I'm not a scholar. Don't like. I will never ever pretend to be. But I've read on it. I've looked into it. I've heard Orthodox apologists talk about it. I've heard Catholic apologists talk about it. I've gone into it, and for the life of me, even now, I cannot fathom how it makes any practical difference. Uh, like, I believe people who insist that it does. I mean, it's even appeared in church documents. It's like, no, it does matter. I don't see it. I'm frankly not smart enough, right?
Right.
Like, this is not me being modest. I'm being quite honest. Like, from theologians that I have read, they have insisted that there is a difference, and I don't see it. I don't think that the average Orthodox or Catholic person is that invested in the filioque controversy. Maybe the very high level theological types were, but not the average person.
Right.
What they were actually upset about at the time was having to say the Pope is in charge. And
Yes.
with that said, there is something to that too, theologically. Now, this is a different sort of theological dispute than the Protestant Catholic one. The Protestants will get there eventually if they work through everything else. Uh, yeah, like once you work through everything else, you're left with the Pope at the end as like the final boss. Uh, yeah, you work through you work through Mary, but the Pope's the final boss, and you're like, I don't know, man, and that's why a lot of Protestants, like the Protestant to Catholic pipeline, goes like low church to Lutheran to Anglican to Orthodox to Catholic.
Yeah,
Uh,
basically.
and I have met people who like literally, I met a priest once, a Dominican priest who like explained it in exactly that way. He's like, "Yep, that was me." Uh, like low church, Lutheran, Anglican, Orthodox, Catholic.
Yeah.
Because as you slowly tear down whatever barriers in your mind are forming over all of these different things.
Right.
Uh,
And it's
so
often like I talk to these people, and many times if I say, well, there's this, the if situation with Mary involving her immaculate conception. There's this logic problem. There's this logic problem with the nature of sin and internal birth. Oftentimes it's not understood. Well, God did it specifically for her. Okay, but there's a problem for it. If God could remove sin without blood sacrifice, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I don't want to get into it. But there's like
we'll
things
have
like
an
the
Immaculate Conception stream one day. Uh,
no, but yes. But then
no,
there's
but
things
yes,
like
I know, I get it.
but then there's the filioque, and it says, and in the Holy Spirit, the Lord, the giver of life, who proceeds from the Father, and then the filioque is and the Son, who with
Right.
the Father and the Son is adored and glorified. So it's about the Holy Spirit, and
Yeah.
it's the question of is the Father and the Son over the Holy Spirit, or is it just the Father who's over the Holy Spirit? Uh, as
Sort
in
of. It gets
emanates.
into procession. It gets into like what does procession mean? Is my
Exactly.
understanding of it, and it gets into very. But that's my point. Like you get into things. One of the big disputes at the Council of Florence, it was a huge
Well,
dispute, was
hold on. If
purgatory.
somebody cares about the filioque, have them describe the Trinity first, and we'll see if it works out.
Yeah, right. But you're not wrong. But uh, like for an example here, like the big thing at Florence, like probably outside of accepting, hey, the Pope is in charge, which obviously needed to be one of the pieces in place, but probably the biggest theological thing was purgatory. Now,
Mm,
once again,
and the loss
between
of
the ortho
salvation.
yeah, between the Orthodox and the Catholics, the problem that I have is, well, yes, if you get into very fine, granular theological disputes, you can probably, maybe with some Orthodox, find a genuine difference between their beliefs on purgatory,
Mm,
right? Like, with some, and by the way, with some Orthodox, too, to be clear. Like,
right.
yes, if you get very granular with it, let's be honest here, for the average Orthodox in the street or average Catholic in the street, they're really not going to have much of a problem accepting two belief systems on the side that are very similar, which is why I look at like Mark of Ephesus going, no, we will never submit to Rome. And yes, on one hand, when it's religion, you absolutely can't, even at the cost of life. That is
Right.
like the obvious. That's how martyrdom works, right? That's how it works.
Right.
But on
And
the other
there's
hand, I look at it as like how much of this is really you taking a religious stand and how much of it is pride.
oh
I
yeah,
don't know. I'm a little suspicious.
most of it is pride for the Orthodox.
I'm a little bit suspicious. Just a little. Just,
Just a
that's my
little bit.
point.
Just a
I,
little
I,
bit.
I hope that that's clear. Like, I'm
Yeah.
not saying that every single person who is not a Catholic is only doing that because they have this massive pride. Like, I agree with you in the sense of if for whatever reason you can't accept XYZ Catholic doctrine and you think this is significant enough that it pairs a hole in the Catholic conception of what Christianity is, then logically speaking, that means that you can't really be a Catholic, right?
Right.
But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a group of people that functionally, the vast majority of them are not really going to have significant theological issues with the West, but are having trouble humbling themselves to be like, we need help.
Right.
Yeah, like badly. And that said, I'm also will admit that I might be being a little bit unfair from
A
my
little bit.
perspective. So I'll move on.
I think you're underestimating the amount of interest average people have, and especially medieval people had, in things like religious differences. There was during the monophysite thing, there was a whole issue where supposedly you could not even buy bread without knowing the baker's opinion on monophysitism versus uh, whatever the other one was that was
You might be
heretical.
right, but the thing about the monophysite heresy is that to me, that's not a niche theological issue. That is a very obvious, very large theological issue that fundamentally changes how the faith works.
Yes. I'm not
Right?
arguing with you on that. I'm just saying don't underestimate, like
That's
we're a
true.
pair of nobodies and we're still arguing, quote unquote arguing, over religious differences 1,000 years ago and 1,500 years ago and more. And it's like, more and more I think of this sort of thing as inevitable, as a delight of the Christian, a sport in fact. Um, Even though my pastor certainly wishes I wouldn't. Uh, I'm kidding. I've toned it down. There was quite a few stories of martyrdom that came out of the siege of Constantinople, including supposedly Mehmed II demanding to outrage the sons of Docus, one of the chief magistrates who did not die in the fighting but was captured. And he said, "I'd rather you kill me and my sons as well." So Mehmed has him executed, and the sons spurned him as well, and were killed in turn. And supposedly Mehmed II killed another young boy who fought him. Though the truth of these stories is very, shall we say, questionable compared to others. There certainly were quite a few people murdered for refusing the Muslim faith. And each one is a personal story of heroism. Even with Constantine Palaeologos' example of how a man should live with virtue, even as the world comes down upon him to crush him and to remove one of the bright shining stars of Christendom, he still fought to the bitter end. And that is an example worth living up to. And of course, there's these compelling personalities of Mehmed II and Constantine Palaeologos. These were men driven by destiny. I would prefer a man as heroic as Constantine Palaeologos to be at the fall of Constantinople than I would somebody like Romulus Augustulus. I will remind you that the last emperor of Rome who mattered, who was, an emperor crowned, was a 14-year-old boy put there by his father. And in fact, some people even consider it to be a deliberate and cruel joke on the part of the father. In fact, his name even means little Augustus. It's like a wet fart or something like that. Like it is the most absolutely horrible way for an empire to die. Not with, a heroic man in the last stand against the longest odds that has ever been, not giving up until the bitter end. And then you have a 14-year-old boy put there by his father, as he goes off to war and then loses against Ottawasser. Um, who was like, this is it, this is done, we're done, and sent the regalia to Byzantium. Um, you have things like the Russian Revolution, where you have Tsar Nicholas II, unable to hold back the tides of communism and to defend his family. Or you look over and see, what's happening in some other places. You compare um, Bukele to people like Lula of Brazil, where Bukele is defending his country against the cartels, while Lula is making Brazil more and more lawless. There's a clear story here that it is never too late to be sort of the last man, the last hero of your civilization, and that if some way, somehow, you can get into power, um, it is worth it to give it everything you've got. The Even though I do consider the siege to be quite inevitable, the defenders had a very good chance. The bombards might have been very powerful when they hit, but they had to hit any number of things, including reinforcements from the West. If God had inspired, some great king to take up arms, could have come down to reinforce Constantinople. There were many opportunities for that. In the end, though, it was not. And Constantinople was eventually turned into Istanbul. Um, and the Ottoman Empire ruled from there until the end of their days as an empire themselves, which, you know, is what it is. Uh, yeah, but it's a great story. I love it myself. The city has fallen, but I am still alive. What a final saying to go out on. Yeah,
It's
I
great. It's two men of destiny facing off against each other, and Constantine the 11th, though, is in this position where he knows he will lose, but he knows that he has a chance to be an example to the future, and he takes that opportunity.
he does. He does. Even though he's definitely a quote unquote loser of history, if he had not been given the dice he had been given, I do believe that he would have been one of the good emperors of Byzantium. Maybe not as good as Basil Bulgar Slayer or something like that, or Justinian or Heraclitus or others. But he would have been top 10, top 15 easy. And there are a lot of Byzantine emperors, like 88 or something like that. So that's high praise. There were plenty of good emperors too, which is for what they have. Uh, One of the last statements I'll make here is one of the things I chose for the image that is on display on the live stream is that of Kyle Rittenhouse on Kenosha. Though I cheekily took a meme that showed him as the Doom Marine being surrounded by demons. Uh, as a little story of heroism, Kyle went out to give medical aid during the Kenosha riots. Uh, they were dangerous, people were being hurt, and he knew that he had to keep his defense. Now, people say a lot of things about gun violence and stuff like that, but he was rendered innocent of all charges, I will remind you. Um, he went through. He was attacked by people who thought he was, who knows what. Maybe they wanted to rob him. They were three degenerate men One was a pedophile, one was a wife beater, and one was a thief and a man who assaulted people. He killed the pedophile, and I believe he also killed the wife beater. And the third man received a shot through his arm. Uh, they beat Kyle and tried to take his weapons from him and brandished a gun at him. But he still held his own against them. Uh, this continued on.
Incidentally,
Hmm?
yeah, to throw out a conspiracy theory here, I am convinced that the mayor was intentionally sending people down to target Kyle, and that the surprise was that Kyle managed to survive.
That's true. There is drone footage. There is a lot of evidence that the ruling family of Kenosha, which is an Albanian crime family of some kind, though whether their crimes have been prosecuted is unknown to me. I just know how their kind tends to act. Everyone is related within the city government, which is a fact that I can take to the bank. Um, they essentially that either through the FBI or through the mayor or by some police action, not police, I shouldn't say that, but through Fed action is more accurate, they were led to him. There's also some question of the people he was with all of a sudden disappearing. You would be shocked how easy it is to move away from people when you really want to move, and without them noticing. I do it as a bouncer all the time. Yeah, and also come up on people without them noticing. Um, you have to keep your eyes and ears on a swivel at all times. And he was a 17-year-old boy from a broken home. I want to be clear on that. And it's implied with some of the reports I've heard that somebody who had been training him and had been kind of acting as a father also abandoned him to his fate at that time. Um, so we won't know really, perhaps ever about it. But you look at this thing, and Kyle was alone. He was attacked by three thugs of evil repute, who were certainly criminals, who were certainly vicious and willing to do violence, and had proven to do violence. And he defended himself. You do not have to be a king or an emperor or what was what was his name? What was his title? Zurinsky. What was his title? Was he a count or a baron or something?
So he was a ban, which was like was like minor royalty. Like he was in charge of Croatia under the Holy Roman Emperor, kind of, and he was a master. And actually, he gave that up, I believe. Like he had been a ban for a bit. His title, I believe, at the time he died, was Master of the Treasury.
Okay. So, you don't have to be a master of the treasury or what sounds like the equivalent of a count or a baron to, do these things. You can do them on your own, stand against, what comes up against you. Because we cannot be guaranteed of the safety we have enjoyed up until now. It is just that the government realizes, and whoever seeks to destroy us realizes that people like Kyle tend to, even if they become martyrs, tend to inspire further attacks. Unlike some attempts to make it about guns, make it about crossing state lines, no real laws were passed to destroy our ability to defend ourselves. And throughout it, Kyle remains a free man, which is um, which is the most important thing around. His youth helped. The fact that he is bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and chubby-cheeked, good German boy, certainly helped him when the jury looked at him. Because also some other people who were on for similar trial were not so lucky, but they looked like angry rednecks, and it's unfortunate. There are many lessons in the trial of Kyle Rittenhouse that should be learned, but the lesson for this video is clear. At no point should we give ourselves to the enemy, even if we are given that sweet deal to, you know, we still rule, but under the Ottomans, kinda. We're not going to do much. It is better to spit in their faces than it is to submit. Uh, we, unfortunately, cannot raise armies and stuff like that. Thank goodness. I don't think I do too well with that. But what we can do is pray, and we can encourage our fellow brothers in the faith. Whatever I might think of the Pope, I would rather be tortured to death and martyred than to submit to Islam. Uh, the fighting the Pope is quote unquote good war. Fighting Islam is a war of survival. And the gospel may be preserved in the Roman Catholic Church, but you can be damn well sure it would be destroyed by the illegitimate gets of Muhammad. Hmm.
Yeah, no, none of that.
All right. I don't know what we're doing next week, but we'll figure it out by then. There should be a new Pinkerton's Ghost episode Friday that is going out to backers on Monday. Monday. We're very close to the season finale of the Mother Morrow series. We're getting back on the saddle of recording those episodes. I've got episodes from Ken and Anthony in my can that I'm going to send out to them very soon so they can keep working. So do look forward to it and other projects in the future, though sadly not so close appearing. Uh, Thank you. Good night.